Horror Under the Aurora by CavalierRigg. Good evening again. I hope you're all doing well. This past week I was contemplating what story I should share with you, trying to keep up with the flooding in my inbox for my first and second stories. I have had many requests for more stories from the hospital that I work at, but I've been having some trouble picking which story to share, and frankly, I haven't had much time to write with the start of a new semester. However, after finding a little bit of time to write while I'm at work, getting some overtime, I opted to share a story with you all. Not from my job as a security guard at the hospital, but from a creepy experience during my service in the U.S. Army. This story will make more sense if you know a little bit about how I got to be there. After I graduated from high school in 2013, I moved to Usk-Skalinsk, Russia, on the island of Skalinsk, refining my Russian speaking as I acted as an interpreter for Americans at the ExxonMobil natural gas headquarters on the island. I loved my time there, and the nature around the city was amazing. Beautiful mountains on the east to climb and jog through. Snowboarding on the weekends in the wintertime, and taking trips to the south of the island to see Wakanai, Japan on clear days. It was great. However, after 2 years I started getting homesick, so I returned to my hometown in Arizona, where I met a buddy of mine who had enlisted in the Army. After talking to him for a couple of hours, and after meeting with a recruiter the next day, I had officially signed up to be in the next batch heading off to basic training during the summer of 2015. Fort Benning, Georgia felt like hell on earth as I made my way through the 3 phases of basic training and through AIT, Advanced Individual Training, where I finally became an 11B, 11 Bravo, infantryman. I was uncomfortable when I was called in by one of my commanding officers, telling me that higher command had requested all critical language speakers, Russian, Korean, Arabic, etc., go through a few interviews with one of the colonels on the base. My heart raced as I stood at attention the next morning when a full-bird colonel asked me questions pertaining to my language skills, why I had lived in Russia, and how well I spoke. About 2 weeks after our meeting, I was instructed to take a language aptitude test, and upon completing that, I was then called back into the colonel's office. Being a Russian speaker, I was sent to one of my first duty stations, Fort Greely, Alaska, where I would be going through the Northern Warfare Training Center in Black Rapids. Confused, I asked the colonel what this meant, and to dumb it down for me, he explained that I would be learning how to be a soldier fighting in sub-zero conditions against Russia if they were to try to do anything across the Bering Strait. At this point, it was mid-October, and I was heading north in a week. My body hurt from the cold and turbulence, as the 4-point harness strapping me into the seat of the UH-60 Blackhawk bit into my skin. The helicopter droned through the dark Alaskan air at 0400 as we made our way to Rally Point Zulu, deep in the Tiga of Black Rapids, Alaska. I muttered under my breath as the helicopter lurched to the right, causing me to look at the faint teal glow from my tactical watch. 11/30/2015, 04:11. 2 degrees Fahrenheit. The written and classroom portions of the training had not been too hard, and we were on our way to spend the next 3 days in the dense forest and deep snow, putting our skills and survival strategies to the test. I leaned my head back to try desperately to get some sleep before we reached our landing site. As I began to drift off to sleep, I thought to myself how rare it was to like all the guys in my squad and platoon. Most of the men in my squad were older, and all of them had quite colorful senses of humor. Most of them were from all around the country, except for 2 natives to Alaska. Anchor, a 20-year-old guy from Anchorage, and an Alaskan Native American called Beads, named after the beads that he kept wrapped around his arm, given to him by his father, to ward off evil and protect him in battle. Beads was a younger guy, like me, and was a specialist and translator in Native Alaskan/Bering languages. And during any potential time for war, he would be part of a psychological operations unit that would try to turn native Inuit Russians to fight for us. Beads and Anchor during only this short 9 days, had already become two of my closest friends after we had been put together as a 3-man team within our squad. I jerked awake from my dozing as the cold wind began pouring through the now open door of the Blackhawk. The rotors whipping snow in every direction as the chopper crew chief signaled us that this was our stop. I slid my eye protection down and grabbed my weapon as we exited the helicopter's chemical light-marked exit door, making sure to duck under the spinning rotors above me as we moved to the tree line. Our rally point was a near-perfect circular opening in the dense walls of the trees around us, no doubt groomed and cut back by the Army for training purposes and a safe landing zone for aircraft. As the last guy slid out of the bird, the crew chief raised his fist as he slid the door closed, and the Blackhawk returned to the blackness and whirlwind of snow as it disappeared from view, leaving only its loud whirring to grow ominously quiet. A light snow began to fall upon us as we began setting up the camp in complete blackness, desperately trying to use the red glow from our tactical lights to help us set up our equipment for our new patrol base. I set up my weapons tripod, turning to see the platoon leader, an officer, barking orders and swearing at us to move faster, as the graders and training cadre were taking notes on the soldiers' task and effectiveness to grade who would pass the course. Our platoon leader and commanding officer was a newly commissioned second lieutenant from Alabama named Lieutenant Stoker. He was a lanky guy who had gone through his college's ROTC program and acted like he knew the Army inside and out. In the Army, we have a saying, respect the rank, not the man. And nobody really embodied this as well as Lieutenant Stoker embodied this saying on this particular cold morning. Brash, arrogant, and quick to pull rank, Lieutenant Stoker was already having a hard time commanding the respect of his troops, with his constant whining, blaming small mistakes on his gear, troops, or circumstances instead of on himself. To make matters worse, Lieutenant Stoker had taken a special disliking to me, Beads, and Anchor as he overheard a private conversation I was having with our squad leader about my distaste for the lieutenant. Stoker knew I didn't like him, and he was going to make sure that in his mind, that hatred was warranted. To add insult to injury, him knowing that Beads, Anchor, and I were friends, he had assigned us extra duties that ate up our free time before we were to set out into Phase 2 in the forest, effectively canceling my ability to ride home for the week and interrupting a small ceremony that Beads said would bless us with safety as we entered into the dense Tiga. It was also for this reason and personal distaste that I was assigned to carry one of the platoon's M240B machine guns, which is about 25 pounds. I had to carry it through the deep snow, with Anchor and Beads being my assistant gunner and my ammo bearers respectively. The next day was long and grueling, climbing up ice-covered hills, lifting equipment over snowbanks, and moving through the pine trees that were so tightly packed together that visibility was only about 3 to 4 meters in front of you at any one time. Moving through the snow was long and irritating, and breaks were frequent as we managed to move within 3 kilometers of our target zone. While most of the training itself is classified, I can tell you that part of the training includes taking blanks, which are bulletless rounds of ammunition, with laser adapters on our weapons, and compete against other squads and platoon-sized elements attempting to attack them. To oversimplify, the Northern Warfare Training Course was having all of the students play a large game of laser tag whilst having objectives and smaller tasks to reinforce the frozen warfare instruction that we had had back at Fort Greely. Suddenly, I saw a flicker of movement on my right as Beads dropped to the snowy ground. I rushed up to him, breaking our temporary fireteam wedge formation to make sure my battle buddy was safe. And that's when I saw it. A dead snow rabbit. Blood splattered the ice and snow around it as the black gleam from its eyes looked up at us from its eviscerated body. Chunks of what I can only imagine were its organs were scattered in different directions, some hanging from the branches of the low bushes nearby. It was a gruesome and absolute mess. Beads held a talisman close to himself as he started rhythmically chanting in what I could only assume was his native language. A prayer for the animal spirit, he told me, as he began covering the lurid sight with snow. I could see the fear in his eyes as he motioned for me to get back over to my spot in the formation. "A bad omen," he whispered as we separated. I don't know why, but before then I had never felt quite so uneasy in my entire life. There was an aura of dread. After giving the all-clear hand sign, Lieutenant Stoker ordered us forward. After about another hour or so of bushwhacking, the trainers and overseers called for us to set up camp for the night in a small clearing. It was similar to our initial landing zone, except in size. The clearing stretched for almost 200 meters in every direction from the center, with the center itself being a raised hill-like terrain feature, an ideal high ground and a defendable position. It was every soldier's dream. I sighed as I looked at my watch, 15:12, which means 3:12 p.m. For some that don't know, when you are close to the Arctic Circle in the wintertime, you only get about 6 or so good hours of sunlight before the sun sets again. And most of the day is bathed in long shadows as the sun glides horizontally across the horizon. We were instructed to pull 360-degree security, entrench ourselves in the snow, and set up our 3-man winter camouflage pup tents. Because we knew that the enemy team was in the area, we didn't want to risk an ambush during the long night without being prepared to make them pay for attacking a raised hill. Lieutenant Stoker set my fire team up on the northern apex of the triangle that would become our patrol base for the night, crowning the top of the hill. This wasn't out of the ordinary, as Army doctrine teaches that you put the highest casualty-producing weapons on the apex of patrol bases, so that in case of attack, they can swing and pivot to one line or another, depending on where suppressing gunfire was needed. We set up our equipment facing the north, our M151 spotter scope, and the M240B looking deadly and facing the pitch-black forest and the snowy field below. Beads, Anchor, and I set up our rotations. 1 spotter, 1 gunner, and 1 asleep in the tent with rotations every 2 hours. Anchor and Beads volunteered to be the first watch as I got into the tent and turned my radio headset down as to not interfere with my sleep, but to still be able to hear orders from my commanding officer or from the guys if they needed me. I felt my eyelids close immediately from what felt like lead bricks as the fatigue from the long day slowly entered my body. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by a loud, blood-curdling, guttural scream in the distance, followed by a brief few moments of silence.
Hunter 1-7, this is Hunter 1-9. Did you hear that?
The quiet radio transmission whispered into my ear as one of the other soldiers was trying to get into contact with the lieutenant.
Affirmative, Hunter 1-9. What was that? Hunter 1-5, update.
The lieutenant called back, requesting for Beads to help shed some light on the situation.
I'm not sure, but we're not the only predators out here, sir. Packs of wolves are out here too. They are probably just hunting. That sounded like the death cry of a caribou to me. Affirmative. Keep your eyes peeled and watch for wolves.
Lieutenant Stoker replied back, unsuccessfully trying to hide the unease in his voice. Satisfied with Bede's explanation, however, the radio went back to silence as I could hear slight shuffling in the snow outside, most likely from Anchor or Bede's repositioning themselves for comfort. I breathed a sigh of relief as the soft glow of my watch informed me that I had another good hour of sleep left. I was shook awake by Anchor, who had opened the tent for me to start my watch. I gave him a silent high five as I took my spot on the M240B, laying down and attempting to clear up my sight picture down the sights. The world started coming more into view as my night vision monocular powered to life to give me an infrared view of the field in front of me. I looked up and took in the beauty above me. Bands of greens, purples, and reds danced silently above us as the northern lights shimmered in the atmosphere. Despite the dark and cold, the nighttime sky was lit up with more stars than I have ever seen before, all spectating the luminous dresses and fluttering colors of the aurora. To this day, that sight was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. My train of thought was suddenly broken by Beads patting my helmet with the palm of his hand as he whispered over the radio as it crackled to life.
Sir, Hunter 1-5 on red side element. We have positive movement through the trees, bearing 281 degrees at 11 o'clock, 212 meters away.
I turned my weapon and dialed in the distance to the site as I struggled to scan the tree line for what Beads was seeing as I heard the lieutenant confirm Beads' call and told us that he would crawl over to our apex. I kept scanning the tree line, desperately hoping to see the outline of a few soldiers trying to set up a raiding party. However, as I looked beyond the tree line, I saw what Beads was talking about. Just barely behind the tree line was an extremely tall, lanky figure, maybe close to 8 feet tall, with arms that came well down to its shins. While I couldn't make out too many details in the dark, I could easily make out its figure as opposed to the trees around it due to its movement. The figure was swaying almost from side to side, seemingly shifting its weight from one foot to the other, with its head moving ever so slightly from the left to the right in an inquisitive manner. Was it staring at us? I thought to myself. My blood turned even colder at the prospect of whatever this thing was, attempting to figure out whether it would attack us. Lieutenant Stoker made his way into our foxhole as he looked into our M151 at the figure in the tree line. "What the?" he whispered to himself as he stared at the creature, which we were becoming increasingly more convinced was staring back. "Sir, what do you—" I began before I was cut off by a loud combination of a shriek and a roar as this thing took off running on all fours, directly towards our position. 200 meters. My mind screamed as I tried to follow the beast with my barrel, but it was incredibly fast. Within a few seconds, the thing was already more than halfway to our position and was closing in fast if we didn't do something. 100 meters. "Contact!" Lieutenant Stoker screamed, which was repeatedly yelled all through the camp as soldiers made their way to help us hold the line. Strobe-like muzzle flashes rang out in front of me as I death-gripped the trigger, never letting go, while Beads was belt-loading the rounds into the chamber. I recall praying that the loud noise and light would scare the monster away, as well as praying that it would not call our bluff. You see, we had no real ammunition, save for a few of the Proctor's security weapons against animals. All of our brass were blanks with laser adapters. 50 meters. I could hear the beast screaming as it began to charge the base of the hill, its features becoming more and more visible. Matted and patchy fur, a bare human chest, with facial features and eyes that were both part man and part wolf. There were red glowing eyes and claws for hands. 25 meters. I gripped my combat knife in its sheath with my left hand, never letting up on the trigger as my barrel began to glow red in the night, the ambient heat around it starting to melt the snow near the bipod mount. As it came closer, I could hear shouting from the middle of the line as the Proctors aimed their loaded M16s and began firing at the creature. This time hearing sickening cracks as rounds connected with its lanky body. The kinetic energy from the rounds caused it to rear backwards on its hind legs, exposing its chest for more. 3-round bursts sent the monster falling backwards, all the while screaming and wailing as it began to run down the hill in full-blown retreat. As the creature ran into the tree line, the Proctors continued to keep firing shots until a ceasefire command was heard, and we were once again engulfed in the cosmic lights above us and the stillness of the night. Radio chatter buzzed to life as the Proctors called for an index, end of exercise, and an emergency heli evac. We were given express orders to pack up and get our gear ready for transport, and within 20 minutes, we could hear the all-too-familiar buzzing of the helicopters, followed by guide flares being lit up and thrown out to mark our location for the landing zone. Despite all the excitement, once I harnessed myself into the aircraft, I nearly immediately fell asleep as the adrenaline left my frozen body. The next day we were debriefed and informed that we would need to do the operation over again, but that we would pick up where we left off in a week's time. The report to hire from the lieutenant and the Proctors was that a large wolf, probably starving and separated from its pack, was driven to attack alone due to hunger. However, we know the real story. Beads, that evening while we were in the barracks, built a small shrine with a few of his talismans, runes, and a few sets of small bones, and began to pray for our safety, as well as the safety of his tribe and the animals in the forest. After he was done, he got up and tied 2 lanyards of beads on the post of our bunks. I noticed his red and puffy eyes as he laid down in his bunk, which was next to myself and Anchor, and he turned to face us. He sighed, reading the questions we had on our faces, and began to explain what that thing was. After Beads had seen the rabbit and received a terrible feeling, he noticed that the small rabbit had not been eaten, but it had merely been killed out of cruelty or for sport. This, coupled with the creature we saw later that day, confirmed what Beads had already been fearing. It was an adlet. Beads explained that an adlet was a Wendigo-like werewolf being in Inuit lore, the cursed offspring of a woman and a dog. Adlets were known to their tribe to stalk and kill anyone in the frozen waste that intrudes on its territory or that wanders into the forest. According to him, whole hunting parties have been killed by adlets, and that we were very lucky to have escaped with our lives, especially considering that Beads was unable to burn sage and herbs to ask the great spirits to protect us before we left. Despite that day being a few years ago and more than 3,000 miles away, I have all but lost my ability to comfortably go hiking, much to the disappointment of my wife. I don't have the heart to tell her why I refuse to go into the woods anymore, especially at night. On the few nights that I must spend outside in a patrol base for my National Guard duties here in Utah, while I'm a college student, I make sure to burn sage and ask a higher power for protection from whatever could be out there. While sometimes it feels silly or overly superstitious to do so, the memory of those horrifying howls and shrieks drives away any fear of being mocked by my unit, and replaces them with fresh fear from that night when I saw true horror under the aurora. Well, everyone, I would like to thank you again for being with me tonight, and I hope that you all enjoyed the story. I'll try to put out another story from a hospital security guard by next week. But as I'll be taking this weekend off to spend time with my wife, it may or may not happen. Anyway, have a great night, and I'll see you all soon. CavalierRigg.